Hello there, people of the internet. I have a really interesting setup in my recording studio right now, and it's not something that I've had before. So let's go ahead and have a look at some of these different Italian rifles that I have. Let's go ahead and start off with a little bit of context and idea as to what was going on during the time period where these rifles first started showing up. This right here is a old school Vetterli rifle. This right here is a 10.4 millimeter cartridge, and it's pretty typical of what you would see way back in the day when black powder was, being used on a regular basis because smokeless powder had not quite existed yet. This rifle came about in around the 1870s or so, and it was actually originally a single-shot black powder rifle. About the time of the 1860s to about the mid-1870s, countries all around the world were trying to transition from muzzle loaders to metallic firing cartridge breech loading systems. With the exception of the French, they used paper cartridges, and the Dreyse rifle used paper cartridges. But eventually, those would start to lean into metallic cartridges, as like the French adopted the Gras rifle, and etc. etc. That's for a French video later down the road. Today, we're going to talk about the Italians. So, the Italians, before the 1870s, were using essentially muzzle loaders for the most part, and they adopt the Vetterli rifle in, I think, 1870, and it was this, essentially, minus the magazine tube. What the Vetterli rifle is it is a bolt-action system, originally a single-shot system for a 10.4 millimeter black powder cartridge. This old girl has seen better days. This one's from 1889, and it has definitely been in better shape. But single shot black powder rifle, it did not take long for countries to start to look for repeating rifle systems, and a lot of countries tried to adopt their already existing single shots with some sort of magazine or some sort of system to allow for more ammunition. I know during the 1870s, here in the United States, we were utilizing this as our single-shot black powder rifle. This is the U.S. Trapdoor Springfield in 4570. Fantastic little rifle here. It sends a 405 grain projectile at approximately 1,400 or so feet per second, which is definitely a large hunk of lead moving very, very quickly. I would not want to get hit by that. Compared to the 4570, the 10.4 millimeter is not as powerful, but it's still quite the hunk of lead going downrange pretty gosh darn quickly. So, that being said, about the 1880s or so, about that time period, countries are really seriously starting to look to adopting repeating rifles for their militaries. And like I said, many wanted to convert their old rifles into new repeating rifles. This way, they could just utilize old stock, and they didn't have to spend a bunch of money making new rifles. As a matter of fact, the United States actually did that with the Trapdoor Springfield to an extent, and they designed a tubular magazine to run underneath the Trapdoor Springfield, and that was kind of what they came up with for a repeating rifle, but that never really went anywhere. Eventually, the United States would adopt the Krag rifle, but that's a topic for another time. So the Italians, about the mid-1880s or so, I think it was 87, would end up adopting a magazine onto their single-shot Vetterli rifles so they could have extra capacity. I'm not sure how many rounds this magazine holds. I think it's 3, but it might be 5. So the Italians had repeating rifles in their single-shot rifle. Now, doing something like that with a bolt-action firearm is a lot simpler than something that has, say, a trapdoor system on it. So the Italians now have their repeating rifle, and it's in black powder, and they're like, hey, cool, great, we got cutting-edge technology. And then, I think it was actually a little bit earlier than the Italians adopted this right here. The French showed up with their Lebel rifles, and they were like, hey, guess what? We have smokeless powder now, and we're putting black powder to shame, and it's essentially antiquated overnight. Or antiquated? Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for. Antiquated overnight. And so the Italians, they look at their Vetterli rifles and they're like, well, these are great, but unfortunately, the entire world is starting to move towards smokeless powder, so we have to as well. and thus enters the Carcano rifle. Let me go ahead and move Vetterli out of the way here. And thus enters the Carcano rifle, originally designed and adopted, well, originally adopted anyway, in 1891. This right here is kind of on par with a lot of other mechanical systems that were being adopted by all other countries during the time period. It's a nice, long rifle, pretty stereotypical of the day. And countries thought with this new fast-moving propellant, battles were going to be taking place at far distances. So I think the minimum zero on the Carcano is like a 400-yard zero, which is on par with the Gewehr 88 that Germany was using, which also had a minimum 400-yard sight. There is an unusual sighting system on this to where you could zero it for like 200 yards or something like that. But I'm not exactly an expert on the zeroing of a Carcano. I just kind of pull the trigger, and some of them hit high, some of them hit right on point, some of them hit like low. It depends on the Carcano. Like, from my experience with what I've seen, basically every individual Carcano is going to hit differently. There is no individual zero for each individual rifle. It's, hey, here's your rifle. It might hit a foot high, might hit 3 feet high. You're going to have to figure it out on your own. So the Italians adopt the Carcano in 1891. Fantastic little rifle. It's a 6-shot bolt-action rifle that feeds from a Mannlicher-style magazine, has 2 front locking lugs, and it is a far stronger system than the Vetterli system. Now that matters because the Carcano, chambered in 6.5 Carcano, was fine and dandy, but the Italians actually went and they rechambered a bunch of their old Vetterli rifles for 6.5 Carcano, which is what we have right here. This is the old school Vetterli system, same rifle that we were just looking at, except it was converted to take the 6.5 Carcano cartridge. The Italians did this with the idea of knowing that the Vetterli rifle was just not strong enough to be able to handle the cartridge, but they figured that converting these guns and having them on standby would be better than having no guns at all. And the Italians were very uncertain of the future. They weren't sure if they were going to be able to get enough Carcano rifles made to be able to meet the demand of anything that might show up. And they saw World War I on the horizon. So, of course, the Italians just converted all these old rifles, and they figured, hey, if we don't need them, great. But if we do need them, we have them. Now, the Italians would go about giving these rifles out, the Vetterlis that are rechambered for 6.5. They go about giving those out as like war aid and giving them to allies and whatnot, and they would see use across multiple different countries and multiple different fronts, but not necessarily like frontline service to an extent. I know whenever the Italians had first invaded Africa and Ethiopia, they did not want to send over their Carcano rifles, so they sent over their Vetterli rifles to kind of take care of the job. And the Vetterli rifle did not perform well enough to take care of the job. The Ethiopians beat the Italians out of their country very, very effectively, and that's just kind of how that song and dance goes. Now, of course, World War II rolls around. The Italians show up with Carcanos versus Vetterlis. Of course, there's a lot more going on than just that. And the Italians manage to, well, basically win that conflict and take over that section of Africa. And then the Allies invade Africa, and you get the African campaign. And that's a whole story for another time. But we go from single-shot black powder to repeating black powder to the newfound smokeless technology, to converting old black powder into that newfound smokeless technology. Then the Italians would go about using these Carcanos for a very, very long time. Of course, there are a bunch of different versions of Carcanos out there. And I keep saying Carcano. I'm sure some people are going to yell at me, tell me, hey, it's Carcano or Carcano or whatever it is. Whatever it is, how you want to pronounce it. As far as I'm concerned, if you know what I'm talking about, that's good enough for me. But a bunch of different Carcanos were made. We got the nice long rifle like what we have here. There were a bunch of short rifles. There were short rifles with bayonets attached to them. There were a good number of ones. The Carcano, in my personal opinion, is one of the absolute most underrated firearms ever. This right here is such a good bolt-action system. It's nice and strong. There are these chambered in 8mm Mauser out there that don't have any issues. This right here does have front locking lugs inside of the system, which is very similar and reminiscent to that of the Mauser 93 action. So it definitely has that level of strength to it. It's a front locking lug, dual lug system. So combine that with the extremely lightweight 6.5 Carcano cartridge, and you got yourself a really, really nice shooting rifle. If you get one of these that does not have the barrel cuts in the means of affecting the gain twist rifling that are in these things, meaning a lot of the carbines that the Italians made were just long rifles that were cut down, and the Italians used gain twist rifling inside of those rifles, so whenever you cut the barrel of a gain twist rifling barrel, then you don't have the accurate or the appropriate twist rate inside of your barrel anymore, and as a result of that, the bullets don't really stabilize all that well. So as long as you are using a Carcano that does not have a cut barrel that affects the twist rate, I mean, there are carbines out there that were made from scratch with the appropriate twist rate, but as long as you're using a Carcano that doesn't have a cut barrel with the gain twist rifling in it, and you're using the appropriate sized bullet inside of your Carcano, then you can actually get some pretty gosh darn accurate systems. One of the big things with Carcanos nowadays is that nowadays a lot of modern ammunition manufacturers are making them with smaller projectiles than what they actually call for, because the commonplace projectile for a 6.5 millimeter round is slightly undersized. There's a lot of cartridges out there on the market that take that specific undersized bullet, and the Carcano is the only rifle that takes a little bit larger of a bullet. So rather than go through the logistical issues of producing ammunition for this that has that slightly larger bullet, you just put in the commonplace, common size, slightly smaller bullet, and it works well enough to be able to safely and effectively send lead downrange with these, but the accuracy is not quite as good as it normally would be. Use appropriately sized bullets in these things, and you get yourself a rifle that's not completely shot out like this one right here absolutely is. And you get yourself one that doesn't have the gain twist rifling all cut up and messed up and whatnot, and you get yourself a really, really nice, accurate, light recoiling rifle. The ammunition, it can be a little bit difficult to find, but there is a lot more of it coming up onto the market, and I personally am a hand loader, so I don't really have issues with that. I can go out and fire this thing all day long, and because the ammunition is such a lightweight style of ammunition, meaning it's low pressure and whatnot, the brass doesn't stretch all that much, so I can reload the brass for the 6.5 Carcano multiple times. Now, if you are going to go out and use 6.5 Carcano in a 6.5 Vetterli rifle, you want to make sure that you're using an undercharged level of ammunition. Typically, the good go-to is about 50% charge. I'm sure some people are going to point out CN Arsenal's thing about how they blew up their Vetterli rifles. They always do every time I talk about a Vetterli rifle, and yeah, it's just not designed for the pressures of smokeless powder, and that's what you get for a rifle that came out, let's see, 1870, so that's like a decade and a half before smokeless powder was even a thing. So yeah, the Vetterli was good for its time. It is good enough for black powder. Issue is that not long after its construction and creation, black powder changed into smokeless powder, and that's kind of where we're sitting. Okay, well, thanks for watching, folks. I appreciate your time. Like, subscribe, share. Description below has a link to all sorts of stuff. Go check it out. I suppose before I go off, I will show you guys this. The 6.5 Carcano cartridge was in use until World War II, where the Italians tried going to a 7.35 Carcano cartridge, and it did not work out well for them. They went back to the 6.5 because, well, trying to equip your entire army while there's a world war going on, it just does not work out well. The Italians gifted a lot of their 7.35 Carcano rifles to the Finnish. Most of the rifles that you find here that are chambered in 7.35 are going to be Finnish property stamped, just because that's where most of those rifles went. Of course, after World War II, that's when NATO became a thing, and 7.62 NATO gets adopted, and a bunch of countries start looking at self-loading rifles and get rid of their old bolt actions, and that's a story for another time. Okay, already did the outro. You guys go off, have yourself a fantastic day.
Been a little while since I've done this. Bonnie and Clyde be damned. Poor man's Garrett. It's a shame that bolt action shotguns aren't more mainstream.